One of the most crazy executions in English history saw the King, Charles I, on the 30th of January 1649, be taken to the executioner's scaffold, which had been created on Whitehall. He was the man who had plunged his country into the deadliest civil war ever fought on English soil, and he has been condemned by Parliament and figures such as Oliver Cromwell. But the King was met by an anonymous executioner and an axeman who in one swing of the axe took the King's head from his shoulders. However, as the King's remains were gathered up, there was a question as to what to do with the body of Charles I, as Parliament were worried that it would become a royalist relic and be venerated by those who wanted to oppose the new political structure in England. But Charles I was buried in secret, alongside one of the most controversial and notorious kings of England, Henry VIII. But 200 years after his execution, his coffin was broken into. King Charles I's execution was a shocking event in which he was taken under armed escort to the Palace of Whitehall, next to where he would be executed. He was escorted onto the scaffold, and his public were looking on, and he was taken through a window of the banqueting house. Charles made a speech to the crowd that day which was difficult to hear, and he said, "An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." His words were ominous, and were those of a man who believed his time on earth was up, but Charles would then be given himself over to the executioner at around 2 p.m. He then lowered himself onto the block after uttering a prayer, and he told the executioner he was ready by stretching his arms out as the blow from the axe then came crashing down. The King lost his head, and the crowd that day sighed, as they were not necessarily excited with what they saw. Many believed that Charles I was sent by God to rule over them, and that now they would be punished. The executioner did show the King's head to the crowd, but his remains were then gathered together and were placed in a coffin ready for burial. After the execution, the remains of Charles were then embalmed, and during this the royal physicians and doctors sewed the head of the Stuart monarch back on. But there was much debate as to where to bury the lead-lined coffin and the body of the executed king. Parliament began to debate this, and they believed it was too much of a risk to bury the king inside of central London, where it could be dug up, and they did not want to allow Charles the precedent of being buried alongside other kings and queens in Westminster Abbey. Parliament feared retribution and revenge for what they had done to Charles, and they did not want his burial site to become a shrine, but they then came to the conclusion to bury Charles inside of Windsor Castle, and specifically St George's Chapel, but this would be done in secret. It was said that this was a quieter place to bury the king, but the royal vaults would become much busier in the centuries after. In the middle of the night, on the 9th of February 1649, the coffin of Charles I was taken quietly from central London to Windsor, and he was then buried inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII, who was also laid to rest in a purpose-built vault alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour. This was said to have been a rather secretive space. There were plans for Charles II, the executed king's son, to bury his father in a grand mausoleum inside of Hyde Park, but this never occurred, and still today Charles is laid to rest in this vault with Henry VIII, two brutal kings laying side by side. However, for centuries it was believed that Charles's coffin had been lost to time, and thus his remains were missing. But the burial vault containing his body was actually broken into during building work in 1813, and the builders also found the remains of a child's coffin, this being the child of Queen Anne that tragically died. but Henry VIII's coffin was said to have been in a very poor state, as it had been broken, and there were even stories of people breaking into his coffin and stealing his bones. But Charles's coffin was found next to Henry, and the man who was investigating this was Sir Henry Halford, and he opened Charles's coffin on the 1st of April 1813 to confirm that this was in fact the lost body of the executed Stuart monarch. He did this in front of the Prince Regent, the future George IV, but he noticed when he broke into the coffin that Charles's head, which had come loose from his body. As mentioned, his head was sewn back on, but the thread must have decayed in the years since. On top of the coffin was an inscription that said King Charles 1649, and it was noted that the body of Charles I had been prepared in a different way. It was wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, which helped preserve it well, and it was so well wrapped that Halford had to take the body out of the coffin to unwrap it. He then wrote that at length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. And the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the untouched matter between it and cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It's true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, the beard, and the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen when touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. This was a huge achievement for Sir Henry Halford. He had found the remains of the executed King of England, and he even held up the head and confirmed it was Charles without any doubt. He said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebra was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This added further evidence that it was the king, as it confirmed that he had lost his head by a sharp weapon, such as an axe. But after it was said, following the examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again, and the vault closed. This was the last time that the vault of the King Charles I, and also Henry VIII, was opened at all, and Charles was a man who led his nation into civil war, and some believed it was justified what happened to him on that cold January morning on the scaffold in 1649. But in the years after, his remains were unwrapped and his coffin was broken into in front of a crowd of shocked onlookers, including the future king. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.